today we are gonna have another story time. Today's story time is not gonna be so much of a fun story, and it's gonna have a lot of triggering aspects like domestic violence and child abuse and stuff like that. So like if you're not in the headspace for this kind of video, honestly don't worry about it, just don't watch it. However, I'm gonna try and talk about this in a very light and friendly way. I wasn't gonna make this video yet. This is a video that I was gonna make a little bit in the future. I actually had another almost similar video that I was going to make today, but then one of my viewers in my stream did mention how they were in a very unstable home environment and that they really wanted to move to Japan and the struggles that come along with that, and that really resonated with me, and I thought that this video might be useful to people who are in a similar situation. And like now I've been in Japan for 9 years, so I can kind of see the effects now of how that situation affected me. But I'm in a very good place now. I really love my life. I love everything about my life, and I'm very proud of the things that I have achieved, and they are honestly very achievable. So I hope that if you're watching this video and you find yourself in a similar situation, you know that there is a way out of it and things always do get better, because often at times I thought that they wouldn't get better and I would just be kind of trapped in that situation forever. So yeah, let's just jump into it. I made the video before called My Murdery Sister, and a lot of people approach me about that particular video when I'm out at events, and they're like, oh, you're the girl that made the video about her sister who tried to kill her. And I honestly don't want to be known for that kind of content, and I don't really want to keep making that kind of content because I think of myself as quite a positive person. But I also think that those stories and events that happen in my life make up such a big part of my personality now, and I think that they're important stories to hear, because like the video I made before about my sister, I wasn't going to upload it, honestly. I watched it back and I was like, I don't know, like I tried to make it positive, but it still seemed kind of heavy. But when I did upload it, I got a lot of comments where people were in very similar situations, and I didn't realize how many people had almost exact situations to me, and they said that the video really helped them. And if I can make it, like if this video somehow helps at least one person, then it will be worth talking about, because obviously talking about this kind of stuff is like still incredibly really raw. Even after like a decade, it's still very hard for me to talk about, so I'm gonna do my best. Okay, so let's just start from the beginning. I in no way think that my life was hard done by. I think I've been incredibly lucky, but growing up, my family dynamic was kind of hard. The first memory I have when I was a kid, I must have been like a toddler, I'm not sure how old I was, I would say like maybe 1 or 2. My first memory was actually my dad beating up my mom, and I thought that she was gonna die. Like before I even knew the concept of death, I think this was my first introduction to the thought that like somebody could die. And yeah, so like that is a memory that is still very vivid in my head. I don't think about it that much, honestly, but it is still incredibly vivid. And that was something that happened throughout the whole time I lived with my family. Like my dad had very bad anger issues, and now that I look back on my family, I am 100% sure that there is a lot of mental health issues, which is why a lot of the things that my dad did, I'm very angered and disgusted by, but at the same time, I can almost understand why he did those things. And I think that after a long time and a lot of time to process these things, you do tend to be more understanding. So yeah, like growing up, we lived in London, we lived in Essex, we lived in France for a while, we lived in other places in Europe. We traveled quite a lot, which was nice, but mostly it was just me and my parents for the most of it. But I do have other family members that would sometimes come to our house. My parents were alcoholics, which was the biggest part of the problem. And when my dad was drinking, which was like every day, he would normally get pretty hard to deal with. Most of it was directed to my mom, but if I ever tried to get in the way of it, then it would then be directed to me. So it wasn't that bad that I ever had like bruises or anything, but it was often like mostly just getting punched. There were a few times, I'd say like maybe 4 or 5 times, where I literally did think that my dad killed my mom because she would like be unconscious or something like that. But I think for me, that only happened to me like 2 or 3 times. The biggest problem was that my parents would constantly fight. They would constantly fight about anything. And the fights would be from morning till night. And I remember particularly, we used to live in like the countryside. We lived in a place called Rochford, and we lived in a house in like the middle of nowhere, and so I felt very, very trapped because we didn't have a car. So like, I'm not sure why that particular environment made me feel very, very trapped, but we were stuck there. And I remember my parents argued for like 2 months straight, morning till night, just constant arguing, and it was a lot. And a lot of people deal with this in different ways, but when I'm in that kind of such an unstable environment, I tend to just go into my own world. And this is how I really got like super hard into playing like video games or reading like fantasy novels, or honestly, I would just escape to any kind of fantasy I could, like anime or anything like that, as a kind of escape. And I think honestly that was a very good thing for me, because I never really, like, I don't really get depressed as such, as long as I have something to like hyperfixate on. And I found growing up, I always had something to hyperfixate on, so it wasn't that bad. It was hard because like my brother and sister, who are much older than me, you could tell that they were concerned about me, but they couldn't, like, they didn't really know what to do. At sometimes I feel kind of like resentful that no one really did anything, but at the same time, like, it's hard, like, it's such like domestic situations, it's very hard to get involved in another family, kind of the family's domestic matters, and like I'm not sure, looking back, like what they could do about it. And like, again, growing up, when my parents would have particularly bad arguments, like the police would be called, and then the police would say like, if this happens again, then we'll take your kid away, which was very, very scary for me because I didn't know where I was gonna go. But at the same time, like, it happened quite often, and like no one really did anything about it. Like, for me, it wasn't that bad, but it seemed like none of this was ever like investigated, and I'm like, it could have been so much worse. So like, it makes me really, really worried for kids who are in even more extreme environments, because it seems like literally just no one cares. Like, I think one of the most eye-opening moments for me was when my parents had a fight about something stupid, and my mom locked my dad out of the house, and my dad like smashed the window of our house. And we had like these large Victorian windows, so he smashed the window and he like bloodied up all his arm. And like, this is the thing about drunk people, like, they don't realize when they're covered in blood or their hair or something like that. And this would happen a lot, like, as my dad would sustain like pretty bad injuries from things, and he just wouldn't realize because he was so drunk. And like, this is something that would happen quite a lot. So I did something about that, just really, really freaked me out, and I just left my house at night. And I guess we lived in quite a dangerous area, so I just left and I just went away. And I remember just walking down the seafront, like by the sea, and being like, what the fuck am I gonna do? Because up until that point, I've never told anyone about anything that happened. And because I'm so happy-go-lucky, no one would have ever guessed that like my home environment was like so volatile, and I really don't want people to worry about me. And mostly I don't want to be pitied. Like, that is the worst thing. Like, that's the worst fucking thing for me, is like when police would come to our house and they would kind of like pity me. I used to hate that look, and I can tell that look in people's faces. And that's why, like, normally when I talk about this stuff, I only talk about them with people who have been through similar things, because they really, really get it. It's very hard to talk about this with people who haven't lived through similar things, because they just don't understand. It's a very interesting mix of emotions. So yeah, I remember being down the seafront and being like, what the fuck am I gonna do? And then this was at night, and like a man came up to me, like an adult man, and I think I was like 14 or 13, and he tried to get me to go in his car, and I got freaked out and I ran away, and I just ended up at one of my friend's houses, and she let me stay over, and she was great. Like, she didn't ask too many questions. She was like, oh yeah, sometimes, you know, it's nice to get away from your family or whatever, and that was great. Like, she didn't ask any questions, she just let me stay over. Fantastic. And I really thought that would be like a learning moment for my dad, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't act like such a piece of shit because my kid will just run away forever. And you know, like, oh my god, this sounds so stupid, but you know when you watch like kids movies, like I remember watching, I think it was called Cheaper by the Dozen, when they were like, one of the kids felt neglected and he ran away for a bit, and then the parents realized that they've been neglecting him, so after that they took better care. I thought that, not on that level, because I know how like my dad's brain worked, but I thought that it would make him be a little bit more caring, I guess. But then when I come home, I remember he just said to me, next time you run away, don't come back. So I think it was that point where I was like, okay, I just felt like it wasn't fixable. Like, I always thought that maybe things would get better, but yeah, it didn't seem like it was gonna get better. So yeah, things continued similarly. Like, I wouldn't ever invite anyone over to my house because it was just embarrassing, like, can you imagine? And again, like, I started to get into J fashion, so I was like wearing Lolita and going to events and stuff, and like, I have such this kind of like, and of course my personality, I didn't want people to know about this stuff because it's just like, it's embarrassing, and I don't want to be defined by that. I don't want people to pity me, and I don't want it just like an unnecessary conversation. And I feel like you know, like, me and my family are very separate, and I didn't want to mix those kind of things. So for the longest time I kept those things very, very separate. Then I remember when I was in high school, I remember for the longest time I had like this little crush on one of my classmates. I'm not gonna say his name. He's really, really nice, and he's like happily married now to like a beautiful wife. He has like a bunch of kids. He's doing great. It's fantastic, like, just amazing. So I remember we ended up walking home from a party together, and we were talking, and I forget how the conversation ended that way, but he mentioned that his parents were divorced. I was like, oh, okay. And he was like, yeah, because my dad used to beat up my mom all the time. And it was the first time I heard someone candidly say that to me, like, just like so nonchalant, just like, oh yeah, like, this is a thing that happened. And honestly, like, I don't think he realized this, but that was such a like an awakening moment for me, like, oh, like, this is something I can talk about, and this is like not something to be ashamed about. Because he wasn't ashamed. He was like, you know, like, that's nothing to do with me, kind of thing. And that was a really, really healing moment for me, because I've been like growing up, like, I know a lot of my classmates were going through a lot of stuff, but we never talked about it. Like, we would kind of know different things that were going on, but we just wouldn't talk about it. We didn't know the details. So this was honestly great for me, and this is how I realized that I wanted to be able to talk about this. But yeah, ultimately, the last few years living in England, as I mentioned before, were the worst. And as soon as I got my degree, I didn't even have my diploma. As soon as I finished university, I literally just moved to Japan, and I think I only had like 100,000 yen to my name. Like, I was completely insane, but I really did feel like if I didn't get myself out of that situation, then I would have died. Older, like, my parents also did get older too, so like, it got better in the sense that, like, my dad was pretty old, so he wasn't like as active anymore, so he can obviously be as violent, but his depression got way worse, and that was in some respects worse because it was just sad. Like, he was always depressed and volatile. It just wasn't great. And like, I didn't mention my mom much in this, but my mom, I feel like use alcohol as a way for her to deal with the situation. And it was really, really hard because my mom would just disassociate all the time, and often she would absolve herself from the situation. And this is the hard thing when you are in some environment with TV. You feel such an incredible amount of guilt, because I still do maybe even resent my mom a lot, because a lot of the time she didn't really do anything. Like, she would just like when things would happen to me, she would just kind of like shrug it off. Then I think if you've watched my other video, the one where with my sister that tried to murder me, you'll know that my sister did come to live with us for a while, and unfortunately my sister was on very, very hard drugs, so that ended up also being abusive because she would try to murder me sometimes. But the thing is that my mom also would excuse that behavior and would kind of just like disassociate and like shrug it off. So it's hard because I know that my mom was a victim of DV, so it's very hard for victims to pull themselves out of that situation. But then I also kind of feel like she could have done more. And I find when I speak to other victims of DV, a lot of them have this kind of like guilt where you kind of resent them but you still love them. It's very, very hard. Like, I remember when things got really bad and I would tell my mom so that we could try to like fix the situation or like move or something. My mom would say, oh, but like it's bad for me too, like don't you think it's bad for me too, like I'm dealing with this as well. And the difference is that I was a child, and you know, like I had no power. My parents are the ones in position of power, and I feel like a lot of the time they would kind of turn this back around on me, because they would argue so often, like so often, like half of every single week of my life that I lived with them, they would be arguing. And I always told them, please just get a divorce. Like, I think it would be better if you just got a divorce. And they would always say that the only reason they are together is because of me, and they didn't want me to come from like a broken home or whatever. And I'm like, honestly, I think it would be better if you just got a divorce. Like, and then they would get mad at me for being selfish. So like that's another thing I realized about myself, is I ended up becoming incredibly patient with people, and I become very good at negotiating and listening, because that's all I've had to do since I was born, is like negotiate with mentally impaired drunk people to get them to stop killing each other. Like, this has just been my entire life. So like which I think ended up making me a pretty good teacher, because that's essentially what I just do at work, is like stop kids from killing each other. But in some respects it made it a lot easier for me to move to Japan. And I remember the last year that I lived at home, my sister was going insane, and again, like that's around the time that she stabbed me, and my parents were just not doing good. I remember the last year my dad became like hikikomori. He was like a shut-in. He wouldn't go outside. He was depressed. He was angry at me all the time because I didn't want to spend time with him. And like, this is another thing, and this is another lot of guilt I had. But the particular last few years I lived with my family, all of them would scold me because I didn't spend enough time with them, or I wouldn't want to spend time particularly with my dad because he was so lonely. And I felt bad. Like, I felt like a bad person. I felt like a bad daughter. I felt like, because they would always call me a stuck-up bitch, and they would say that like I was more interested in like material things or like J fashion or something, or going out with my friends, than I was spending time with my dad. And honestly, it wasn't the case. I just hyperfixated on those things to like cope with a bad situation. And why would I want to spend time with someone that treated me so badly my whole life? Like, I never got, like, this is a thing that makes me really, really mad about this situation, is I never got to confront my dad about this, because he did die very suddenly because he had been drinking his whole life. I wanted to tell him that a lot of the reason that we didn't have a very good relationship at the end is completely on him. Like, you can't expect people to stick around if you hurt them, or if you call them names all the time. Like, I think almost every day he would call me an ungrateful bitch or something. So like, and why would I want to hang out with someone like that? Why would I want to spend time with someone like that? And I feel bad because that did really contribute to my dad's depression. So ultimately, when he died suddenly, I felt really guilty because I felt like I should have spent more time with him. But then the other half, I'm like, well, he doesn't deserve that. So like, still, you know, like this whole time I've had this like internal struggle of like, should I have spent more time with my dad? Maybe I should have, but then like, maybe he should have been a better dad if that's the case. And the hard part is like, I've only said really bad things about my dad, but actually I really, really loved my dad. My dad was not a bad dad all of the time, and this is something I really want to instill upon you, particularly if you don't know anything about living in a domestic violence situation, is that the people that are doing this to you often love you and you love them. And like, I know it's like, oh, but if they love you, they wouldn't do that. I know my dad loved me so much, and that's the really hard part. So yeah, it was because of my dad that I ended up getting into Japanese stuff, because my dad actually was Buddhist, and he lived in a Tibetan monastery. Like, my dad was a very interesting person. He had so many different hobbies. He's the one that introduced me into Japanese food. My dad really cared about my education. My dad would read to me and read with me all the time. He used to take me to museums all the time. I swear to God, I've been to every museum in London, and that's how I got really into like Greek mythology and stuff like that. Like, so much of my personality does come from my dad, and a lot of the things he did were very, very good. Like, he really did care about me. He was very affectionate. He was very loving. He was a dad that would always hug you. He would always listen to me, and he would always be on my side. Like, I remember I went through a pretty bad breakup. Like, it was my first proper boyfriend really ever, and we were together for 5 years, and he's such a nice guy, and we ended up breaking up mostly because I wanted to move to Japan and he didn't, and it was a bad time, and I remember that a lot of people were really angry at me, maybe justifiably so, that I would end like such a long time relationship because I wanted to move to Japan and like all this other stuff. And I just remember that my dad was literally the only person on my side. My dad was really, really there for me when no one else was. And I remember around that time, he took me on a trip to Iceland. And it was honestly great. Like, he didn't drink the whole time we were there. I think we were there for like 3 or 4 days. And I know it doesn't seem that much, but like for my dad to not drink during that time was honestly just like a miracle. And we didn't argue even one time, and that's also kind of unheard of for my family. It was such a great time, and Iceland was amazing. It's like my favorite country. I want to go back like as soon as possible, and I'm really glad that we made that memory, because that's, you know, my favorite memory with my dad, and just having that memory, I'm like, my dad wasn't, like, again, I don't see people as good people or bad people. I feel like it's normally a mix of both, sometimes more one or the other, but my dad really wasn't a bad person. And I didn't realize until I thought about it years later that my dad had like a lot of mental health problems. Like, one of his very close friends commits suicide, and then sometimes he would hear voices telling the person to join him and stuff like that. It was really, really messed up. And when my dad was a kid, he got kidnapped by this crazy guy with a knife, and the guy made my dad take off all his clothes, and like he locked my dad in like this like hole for like a few days, and he couldn't get out, but luckily some people found him and he managed to escape. My dad was in the army for a while, and like some bad things happened to him there. He's like done a lot of drugs when he was younger. So like, as much as I'm really, really angry at my dad for being a complete and utter asshole, and the things that he did are you just cannot excuse them. But I can also understand that his life growing up was very, very hard too. And I think that part of that is the reason he ended up the way he did. Same with my mom. Like, my mom also had a very, very hard life in places. So when she would kind of like disassociate and like not be very helpful when I could have used her, I do also understand that that's something that I do. And so it made me less angry at my parents if I could see them in a more human way. And particularly as you get older, and like now that it's been like 10 years since I really was last in England, that time to process really let me understand so many things. But most of the reason I wanted to make this video, and I accidentally just ranted the whole time, I'm so sorry, but the reason I wanted to make it is because I wanted to talk about like how it affected me now. And because I remember when I first moved to Japan and I had a roommate for a while, some nights she would just cry, like she was so homesick and she missed her family so much. And I just don't get that. Like I really love my family and I really miss my parents, but I just never got that kind of homesick feeling. And I think in some ways that was good for me because I never ever really got sad or wanted to go back. I just felt like this is here, and from now on this is how things are gonna be. Like I never thought about going back. It also made me more understanding of people, but sometimes it ended up being a negative thing. Like sometimes I over excuse people for doing bad things. I'm getting better at it now. I think it's important to be really understanding, but at the same time I think that you can only excuse people so much. But for me, the worst part is I thought I could get over everything if I moved away so far and if I put enough time between me and those events. And I think I did do so much healing. And honestly, it's not easy. Like, this is the other thing I want to say is, like, if you want to heal over stuff like this, it takes an incredible amount of inner introspection, and you have to want to get better, and you have to self-improve, and you have to try and look for the things in yourself that maybe could be better. And this is something that I meet quite a lot of people who have had similar things happen to them, and they use that as a way to excuse their bad behavior, and I really don't like that. And I know that everyone's different, but I think if there's something about yourself that you know is bad, you should try to fix it, particularly if it's affecting the people around you. So yeah, it just ended up that I had quite bad anxiety, and I always thought that it would get better over time, and it just didn't. And it's hard for me, particularly when I live with someone, and this is a problem that I've had when I've lived with different kinds of people, is that I can't live with anyone that just gets grumpy unnecessarily, which unfortunately is a lot of people, and it's not like a bad trait on their part, but if anyone like slams the kitchen cabinet door or slams down their glass, or sometimes just like says something kind of angry out of nowhere, my blood pressure goes completely up and I start freaking out, and I'm like, did I do something wrong? Like, are you mad at me? And it's not healthy to be like that, and that's something that I really want to work on. And it's hard to explain to people like previous boyfriends, when I would say, please don't just like start the conversation on such an angry note, because it really triggers me. And you know, if you're in a bad mood, try not to like slam doors and stuff like that, because that does as well. And it's hard because a lot of the time I've heard that this is my problem and I need to deal with that, and I honestly get it, but it's really hard, honestly. And I think where I have gone wrong is this whole time I should have already been in therapy, and I realized very recently that I'm very healed and I'm very proud of all the progress that I've made, but I just want to get over anxiety. So I think I'm going to go to therapy in the next few months, and maybe even just take like a small dose of anxiety medicine just to get over this, because I noticed that my anxiety kind of manifested into me being scared of heights and me being scared of flying. And when I feel more anxious, I get more scared of those things. So I feel like if I could somehow get over the trauma I had before a little bit better, then I wouldn't be as scared of flying and heights. And this whole thing made me very aware of mental health and how much we have to take care of ourselves, and how sometimes we don't notice, like the thing about me flying and the thing about heights, it's connected to the trauma that I experienced before, and I didn't honestly realize until recently. But sorry, I don't want this video to be like an hour long. I wanted to make this video so I want people to know that it is very possible to get out of those situations, and it is very possible to get better and to heal, because I'm so much better now, and I really love every aspect of my life, and I'm really excited to heal more. Like, now I've pinned down the problem with my anxiety. I know that that's something that I can work on next, and the thought of me becoming a much better and more healthy person is honestly just so exciting for me. This whole video was honestly very raw and very hard for me to talk about, but it did feel much better to get this off my chest. And if you have been or are going through a similar situation, I cannot implore you how important it is to speak to people, particularly people who have gone through a similar thing. So yeah, I'm kind of tired now. Let me know if you have any more questions, or if you want me to make another video on this subject. I'm gonna stop it here, mostly because it's just, I feel like this is going on too long, and there is so much more I want to talk about on this subject, but maybe at a later date. I'm gonna make a video about dealing with grief while living abroad. That was a video I was actually gonna make today, but I ended up making this one. Thank you for listening. Let me know about your current situation, and if you've ever had to go through anything like this before. And again, I just want to reiterate that trauma is healable, and the things that happen to you are not your fault. And when you deal with trauma, there's a lot of like weird emotions. You'll feel like resentment, you feel like grief, and these are all completely normal emotions, and you shouldn't feel guilty about having them. Yeah, thank you for listening, and please subscribe. I feel like my next video will be much happier than this one.